Hello everybody, my name is Joey. I'm a professional game designer in the video game industry. I've been in the industry for about 10 years and I wanted to give my opinion on this recent document that was provided by Video Games Europe in support of their statement regarding stop killing games. So I, like many others, saw the original 3-paragraph little snippet that they posted on their website, and I didn't know that there was a larger 5-page document that was underpinning that, though I think that that has just been released. And I initially didn't think that this document was real because I couldn't find it until I kind of reverse searched it, and it appears to be real, even though it has some weird spelling and grammar. It has some weird grammar mistakes that I wouldn't have expected in this, so I'm still a little wary about whether or not it's actually real, but let's assume for the moment that it is, and if it isn't, I will, we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. Either way, I have been relatively mixed about my position on this as somebody in the industry, but also a big gamer. And I want you to know up front that I support the initiative completely. Like, we had a 4-hour talk with Ross. It's on our YouTube. I think it was like half a year ago or something, or even maybe closer to a year ago, and it was fantastic. It was lovely. I asked a lot of questions. He had a lot of answers, and we had a really nice time. And even recently, we exchanged some words. And I'm really hopeful that this initiative can see some form of positive change on the industry. My position, though, is that I think that it's going to be very hard to draft legislation for this that achieves the results that gamers probably want, because of some very large hurdles that are in place, and that I just don't see the European Commission actually addressing or getting down into the details with. But I could be wrong, and honestly, I hope that I'm wrong. So I saw that this was released, and I initially wanted to avoid talking about it again because there's a whole bunch of drama. It's very extreme on both sides, and nobody really wants to talk about the nuance behind this. But I read about one page of this 5-page little statement here, and there's just too much in here that needs to be talked about and needs to be detailed that I had to do it. So here I am on a Sunday. It's pretty late. Let's just jump in. I don't want to faff about. Like I said, if this ends up being fake, because I just have a weird feeling about this, although I reverse searched this and it appears to be completely legitimate from what I can see. It's on the Video Games Europe website, which, as far as I'm aware, this is the exact same one. So, either way, let's jump into it, and I'm going to break down piece by piece what I think is right, what I think is wrong, and if I don't know something, I will state it. I'm not an expert on the legal side of this. I just do have a bit more industry knowledge than the average consumer, and also I'm not so extreme about my position that I'm going to say, if fuck all this, the publishers are right, gamers are bad. Of course not. And I'm not going to be on the other side of it saying that the gamers are correct and this is a bad thing that needs to be fixed with some iron fist, right? Because there are going to be some costs that are incurred with this, and if players are okay with that, just know that it probably is going to be passed down to the players in this case. Either way, let's jump into it. Again, I support the initiative. I've always supported it. I just want to make that clear. Please don't come after me when I start diving into some reasons why I think that they're not entirely wrong. Why providing continued support does not work for all games. Introduction. The video game industry is committed to consistently providing players with high-quality, interactive gaming experiences like Concord, and recognizes the passionate community that grows around its games. The decision to discontinue video games' online services is multifaceted and is never taken lightly and must always be a matter of choice. It's money is really what it comes down to, and that choice there is that they want to choose not to lose money. It's just a reality. A lot of online video games die because there aren't enough people playing them, and if your entire business model is for that game is based around the microtransactions or subscriptions, if the cost of the servers, the maintenance, and the updates is too high, you're just going to take that game offline, right? When it does happen, the industry ensures that players are given fair notice of the prospective changes in compliance with local consumer protection laws. Now, I do agree that this is probably true. If they were breaking any consumer protection laws, they would have already had the lawyers on their ass in that case. I think really what it's coming down to is that players don't like the current local consumer protection laws and want those changed. This document explains the reasons why a video game company may decide to discontinue the functionalities supporting the online video game and why this may lead to the video game being no longer playable. Again, there were weird mistakes like this that just made me think that it might be like fake in some way, but I guess it's real. If it's not real, I'll pay the price for that one. Online video games are interactive entertainment. Wow. Color me shocked. Unlike a book or a film, an online video game is not a static work. Online video games are interactive entertainment that combine numerous elements of artistic and intellectual creation with software programming and server infrastructure. Yes. Online video games evolve over time after their initial release, providing consumers with regular new content, experiences, patches, and updates. This is highly valued by players and is required to compete in the market. It involves significant ongoing development expenditure over years, sometimes decades. This is true. Making an online game is extremely expensive. Again, it depends. Online game is extremely broad in definition. It can be anything from just like a local multiplayer type game to an MMO, right, with multiple server shards, and if you take those shards off, you won't have the same experience. It's very broad, but that is the language and the experiences that the lawmakers are going to have to contend with when they're writing laws or intending to write laws about stop killing games. It's very broad, and there are a lot of vague definitions that I think could open up companies to litigation if anyone has a problem with the way that is defined. So that's going to be a nightmare, I'll tell you that. Video game companies put significant investment into creating and developing the best interactive entertainment and experiences for their passionate player bases. Trying to. Concord. The right to decide how, when, and for how long to make an online video game service available to players is vital in justifying this cost and fostering continued technical innovation. There's some truth to this, right? Because when you're developing an online game, you have general metrics of how long that game is going to stay viable, how many players need to be, paying players in order to keep the game servers online. Otherwise, you will need to scale back and eventually cut off that support, right? You can't justify to shareholders and to stakeholders that, well, because of laws, we're going to have to keep this game online for X amount of time, or we're going to have to incur this additional cost. It's very muddy. Let's put it that way. As rights holders and economic entities, video game companies must remain free to decide when an online game is no longer commercially viable and to end continued server support for that game. Here's the reality. This is probably going to be considered true by the European Commission. They get into a little bit of this afterwards, but when you buy a game, you are buying a license to play that game. You are not buying the rights to do whatever you want with it, and because of that, that implies then that the company, the publisher, whoever owns that IP, has the right to do what they want with it, to say when it is taken offline and when it is put back online. And once you start to put those regulations in place, that is going to come with an increased cost of development, and as such, the game becomes more risky in that regard. And this is already talking about a genre of games that is incredibly high risk. I mean, look at a game like New World, with Amazon spending hundreds of millions of dollars to create this game that ultimately is going to probably prove to not be financially viable after a certain point. And there's plenty of examples of this where 10, 15 years ago, you could say that there were games in this space that were highly profitable. Players playing MMOs were, much more common than they are today, and they were less entrenched in their nostalgic safe havens like they are today, where if you want to make an MMO, you have to compete with the big three, which, WoW, Old School RuneScape, and Final Fantasy XIV. And even games that are not MMOs still struggle to compete in this industry against massive giants from like the likes of EA, Ubisoft, from Microsoft and all these things. It's a really hellish landscape, and I think anybody in the industry could tell you that making an MMO is... I'll put it this way. When I get pitched as a designer from other people who have their ideas, they want to see what I think of it, and they say, hey, what do you think of my game idea? It's an online, massively multiplayer RPG, and I'm already like, okay, well, you're going to have at least $20 million to get this started. Because the reality is you have to compete with those people for those entrenched player bases. And it's inevitably a game as a service. It is a game with a lifetime in mind because the game itself has those updates built into it, into the budgeting of the company. And if you have to scale that back because not as many people are playing, then you know it's kind of an inevitable end for it, is that you will have to take these servers offline at some point. Now, I don't disagree that maybe there's some argument that those games like that shouldn't exist, but we're also saying that it's complicated. I don't want games like that not to exist, and I don't necessarily want them to cost more money to make. It's a tough middle ground to strike. Sorry, I was yapping a bit. Imposing a legal obligation to continue server support indefinitely or to develop online video games in a specific technical manner that will allow permanent use will raise the cost and risk of developing such games. This is true. This is just simply true, and it's not that it can't be done, but that it will increase costs and it will incur additional risks. This is true. It will have a chilling effect on game design, fear-mongering, and act as a disincentive to making such games available in Europe. Kind of true. It is far from a trivial modification or a simple addition to the game development phase. It would ignore material, reputational, safety, and security concerns. Now, I think that this line here is more right than people on the outside might think about, and we're going to touch upon some of those points right here and right now in this video. But I would agree that it is not a trivial modification to a game to just make it available for players to play, because reasonable playable state, which is what the Stop Killing Games initiative is requesting from European lawmakers, it's a very vague term that how do you define that? Because I feel like it depends on each game, it depends on each instance. There are games that require multiple server shards to be online for that game to be considered playable with the original intention that that game was meant to be playable in. There are other games where, for how competitive they are, if you remove that competitive atmosphere, and if you remove the restrictions, or because of licensing reasons or security reasons they can't share code to deter hackers and cheaters, that now those community-run servers are going to have those problems. I would almost be able to argue that that's not a reasonable playable state. I cannot reasonably play this game because the moment I jump into a match, there are too many hackers and cheaters. I know this is sounding maybe to people listening to this a little bit trivial, but because of that vague definition of what a reasonable playable state is, and because it almost requires us to analyze that from a nuanced point of view for every single individual case, I feel like there's a lot of loopholes in how it's defined, and again, that does open up the publishers to litigious risks because of that, and people could sue for the fact that they didn't leave it in a playable state because, according to their view of that playable state, it wasn't met, right? I'm sorry, this really is such a nuanced, deep topic that I don't think a short video can do it justice. So I hope that you are okay with the yapping, and I hope you're okay with just opening up and talking about this topic as a whole. Like I said, I'm not an expert on this. I can only provide you with my individual experience and thoughts on this matter from somebody with a foot in both camps. Well, there are video companies that have elected to enable their online games to live beyond that which is being proposed. That is being proposed. Sorry, I have to fix the grammar while I'm reading this. While there are video game companies that have elected to enable their online games to live beyond what is proposed in commercial viability, this is and must always be a matter of choice, as it will depend on what is reasonable and appropriate for the specific games company, and audience. I kind of agree with that. I mean, think of a game like Planetside 2, where you can run around this game without other people. You know, there aren't bots as far as I know in I don't even know if Planetside 2 is still alive. But if anybody remember, it was a game where the control of the map was shaped by the war that was taking place. It was constantly persistent. And you can't really play that solo because, number one, there aren't bots. And number two, you would have to have a private server capable enough of hosting that many players. And it is possible that you would have to define a reasonable playable state from the can players just hosting a server, even if it requires multiple server shards, let's just say it requires $1,000 worth of servers to be hosted a month in order to properly play this game in a playable state, would you consider that to be reasonable in the eyes of the players? Because of course, if a player, I don't even know how to get into this, because the moment that private servers cost money, technically they're commercializing the IP of the company that owns the IP. Let's say there are World of Warcraft servers, right? Which there are. And by putting up a private server that costs money to engage in, which would make sense because it costs money to host that server, and maybe you pay some moderators to help to ban bots or to ban, bad actors, that would be awesome. I think that some players would be willing to support this, not all. But the moment you do that, you are commercializing that IP. And there is a level of legal responsibility that in the European Union that the publisher has, or the company has, the owner of that IP has, to ensure that that private server is not a brand risk and is not causing problems for the larger community that seep into their official gameplay, right? Imagine this, there's a World of Warcraft server that, they add some swastika symbols into their game or something, right? Now it doesn't matter if this is a private server. By the moment that they do that, Blizzard has the rights to shut down this private server, and I would argue that most gamers would say that that was the right decision. But that is a right that they always have as the IP holder. And there's nothing that Stop Killing Games can do. There's nothing that this commission can do when they're revising the law or adding in some restrictions on what these companies can and can't do with their game after end of life that would override this basic core right that IP holders have. And because of that, you could argue that Stop Killing Games, no matter what laws go into effect, they will never be as strong as the IP laws that are already upheld by the European Union and by many other countries in the world, right? So no matter what, the IP holder always has the right to shut down private servers. Now, if they have this, again, you could argue that no matter what playable state they leave this in, the rights of the consumer are not actually being met because they still have this risk of being shut down even when they are operating within their freedom, right? You could say, well, they bought the game according to the law, they have a right to put swastikas in their game, fine, whatever, but at that point they are being a brand risk, they are hurting the IP, and even Blizzard could make claims that if there are some, bad articles written about this, that their brand has been hurt by this private server. So you almost run into a case where in order for the proper legislation to be made according to the initiative's goals, they first have to overhaul how IP laws work. And this may or may not be a good thing. I could argue that this is maybe a bad thing just to let players run rampant with IP. And releasing licensed source code, because really that's what a lot of online games have, is code that is what's the word for it? Proprietary, right? They might have proprietary solutions to certain problems, proprietary solutions to host 100,000 people in their game server or something, proprietary anti-cheat and anti-exploit code. Sorry, again, it's been a long day. And by releasing this, they could open themselves up to have those exploits exploited in the future in their next games, if they have games that are currently out. Let's say like Apex Legends goes down and they release this, and then a new game comes out utilizing the same proprietary code. this could open it up to exploits, right? And this is, again, this is a matter of nuance, because there are cases where you could say, well, they don't have to release this. Just release the game and let the players deal with the hackers and cheaters. But again, this comes down to reasonable playable state, and how do you define that? And by releasing these official tools that have such vulnerabilities that can be easily exploited, you could maybe have some arguments from consumers that they were given a product which allow other people to exploit their systems or exploit their enjoyment of a game. It's a gray area. It's a massive gray area, and private servers have always, like modifications for games, have always existed in a gray area that we've kind of just turned a blind eye to, and I think that that is in many ways a good thing, and in some ways a bad thing, right? Because you might have a case where Bethesda, I think there was a case where Bethesda had supposedly poached a mod for Fallout 4, or a mod for like Fallout 3, to include as a DLC in Fallout 4 or something. I don't know the exact details like it, but technically they're allowed to do that because, well, you know, in their EULA they probably state that any modification owned for the game is technically theirs by right. So again, it's existed in a gray area that for the most part has been reasonably handled. We're not even through page 1. All video games, I think I've read this. Yes, all video games, whether digital or physical copies, are licensed. This is true. As is the case with virtually all digital works, when consumers purchase online games, regardless of their country of sale, what they acquire is a personal license to access and play the copy of the game they have purchased in accordance with the game's terms of service. This is true. This is just what players don't like. I agree with that. I agree with players. The consumer does not acquire ownership of that video game. These clear intellectual property rights underpin the entire market and enable the strong investment that the industry has seen for decades. There is no legal uncertainty about the status quo of video games. Whether you like it or not, this is factually correct. Now, whether players like that is another thing, and I think players don't like that. But again, if you want to go up against this beast, I think, to me, Stop Killing Games is a massive army. Going to war with another massive army, just right in front. It's like a Napoleonic style of fighting here. Both sides are lining up and just shooting their muskets at each other, and then running full charge with bayonets. All right, and this was a pretty dumb way of doing war. As we can see by, let's just say, the American Revolution, where the revolutionaries used guerrilla-style tactics against the Napoleonic tactics of the British Army, and absolutely decimated the British Army with no proper standing army or militia that was made. Pretty awesome. The problem is that I think that Stop Killing Games does need to go for the jugular here and attack the IP laws, but how do you even do that? I have no fucking clue. That's a beast that I wouldn't even want to go up against, because you'd be fighting with companies that don't even have a say in video games, or even much of a say in video games. Now Disney is going to be taking shot because, you know, their IP laws are being risked. It's a massive problem, but I think that Stop Killing Games will not see incredible legal outcomes without first tackling IP and copyright laws. And they're probably going to get into some of this here. Whew. Give me a second, I gotta take a drink. And we can process that mentally while I do so. Why an obligation on video game companies to provide only a limited type of end-of-life plan is disproportionate. It is not clear what the initiators of the Stop Killing Games petition seek to achieve as a legal change. It appears to be a combination of a requirement to provide online services for as long as a consumer wants them, regardless of price paid, and or a requirement to provide a very specific form of end-of-life plan where the game is altered to enable private servers to operate. We do not believe these are proportionate demands. I would agree that some of the wording of Stop Killing Games' petition is vague because they're not lawmakers. I agree with it, but they're also not required to do it. But I think it would help the initiative in every single possible way to be as specific as possible. The problem is I think it's kind of impossible to be. But from my point of view, and from talking with Ross, it's purely an end-of-life plan, is what they want. Online video games are complex operations. They offer interactive features that are supported by multiple servers, enabling functionality of ever-increasing complexity. This is true. Some people might see a lot of online games as being able to be run on a single server, on a single computer, and there are a lot of online games that can be. There are also a lot of online games that cannot be. You might have servers purely for anti-DDoS, for security. You might have servers that are just for running the game logic. You might have servers that are just for running the game's communications. And the reason that you make this modular and you make this separate is so that if any one thing goes down, the rest of the game might not be impacted. I think there are a few off the top of my head cases where I've seen online chat functionality go down, but people can still play the game. Or the sign-in, the handshake server, right? The server you use to authenticate with the game is shut down or goes down, but people who are still in the game can continue to play it, right? They've already been authenticated. They're within the ecosystem. This is really important for stability of the game as a whole. There are also games, name one recent online game that is released and hasn't had server problems. The reality is that you have to put up a lot of servers to manage that many people. And to be fair, when a game is reaching its end of life, you don't have 10,000 people that want to play it. You might only have 1,000. You might have a couple hundred. So you can reduce some of those necessities. You might even be able to run some of those modular systems on the same computer, but there might still be cases of more complex games where in order for the game to actually run the way that it was intended to run, you do need to have that multi-piece setup. And putting that all into one computer may be nearly impossible or unfeasible in a lot of cases. So don't think that they're right about this, but don't think that they're wrong about it either. Like I said, it depends on the game in question. This is integral to the modern gameplay experience that players expect. As consumer expectations for more engaging and evolving content increases, these online features are increasingly becoming intertwined in the overall gameplay experience, as opposed to being limited to a dedicated online mode within the game. In many video games, this interconnected dependency makes it difficult to cleanly segregate online features from offline functionality. Here are the ways in which players and companies would be affected. So again, this is kind of just a different way to what I said, though there's some fluff in here, some more engaging and evolving content increase as well. What this really means is that as online games and the expectations become more complex, so too do the technology running them. I think everybody can understand that is true. Player safety. Reduced or no player protection. Requiring games to run on private servers would result in the inability for game companies to continue to protect players from illegal or harmful content or conduct, as their moderation and player safety teams would no longer be involved. Yes, but that risk has always been there. I mean, it's the internet, right? I think that the reason that companies needed to require this, were required to do this initially, is because they were held legally accountable for this. And you could argue, I think according to like GDPR practices, where EU companies are still required to... Okay, from my understanding, and somebody can correct me if I'm wrong here, if a private server or a game in the EU exists, it still has to follow GDPR practices. And I think that there are also some like brand risk and safety laws that have to be upheld by private servers in the EU. Otherwise, the IP owners could be held, legally responsible for that content. So there is some of this that is true, but again, it's the internet. I mean, you're going to get slurs in games. People are going to find ways to say it, and people are going to find ways to say it in the offline mode too. And I think that define illegal or harmful content or conduct, because if it's, I don't know, if it's like in-game voice chat, sure, agreed. But if it's like an in-game chat with a text filter, well, that can be pushed down to the server code too. It's not a big problem. In particular, cheating could become rampant without proper enforcement. I mean, true. Reporting systems designed to allow players to flag problematic content and behavior to games companies would no longer operate as intended or would have to be disabled entirely. The absence of effective moderation systems would create a less safe environment for consumers and may foster the proliferation of undesirable content while simultaneously frustrating the ability for EU digital services coordinators to act against such content. So now I don't know what requirements in the EU there are for this. I'm not going to take them at their word completely, but I'm also not going to say that they're entirely wrong. This is just true no matter what. Maybe some players are okay with that, but there are some games that are multiplayer that are meant for kids that if you don't have that moderation, I could see there being some problems with that. So I don't know. I don't know any way around it if stop killing games is, desires are met. I really don't see any way around it. Other than like private server moderators need to actually do something to moderate their private servers, which they kind of do now, but they're not paid, so different stuff. This not only presents a safety risk for consumers, but could also lead to brand reputation issues for the video games company. As we talked about earlier, this is 100% true. I don't think there's any way around this, and brand reputation issues do come with legal issues for the people who cause those issues or the people that are responsible for that. And if the publishers and developers are responsible for the end-of-life support and are required by law to provide licenses to private servers, they will inevitably need to have people that look over those, that brand and those private servers and make sure to shut down the ones that present brand issues. Again, I don't see any way around this unless you completely overhaul copyright laws, which I don't see them doing. And there's also some questions here of like what happens if a company goes under and there are, somebody else buys the brand, or what happens if there is this illegal content. I don't know. There's some gray areas here. Maybe you could say that if the company goes under, then there is nobody who owns the IP, but this isn't true. Somebody still owns it. It's just a lot of question marks that would need to be resolved by the legislators. Increased security risks. Releasing game code or server binaries to facilitate the creation of private servers operated by players could expose game companies and consumers to bad actors, malware, data breaches, and DDoS attacks. Yes. This is just simply true. If there are necessary parts of the code or server binaries to run that help to prevent the game and the players at that time, then you could be exposing loopholes and exploits within that code and those server binaries that potentially might be used in future products by that developer or by that publisher. Again, I don't know if this is just a, like buyer beware when you play in a private server. I think that if this is now going to be regulated on the legal level, then there would probably have to be some consideration for this, and I don't know how you do that. I don't know if it's feasible. Doesn't mean that it isn't, just I don't know if it is. Okay, finalizing page 2, we have impact on companies, and there is a little bit here. Significant engineering and architectural challenges. Allowing players to run private servers would present significant engineering and architectural challenges for many games due to the way in which such online features are integrated with other proprietary systems and services required for the game. Yes, yeah, this is just simply true. Now, this doesn't mean that these challenges can't be overcome, but in order to do it, it will come with an increased cost. You'd have to hire more people to solve that, or you'd have to spend more time doing it. Time, people, it's all money in the end. Creating a private server compatible version would be a prohibitive cost, in some cases years or decades after the game's initial release, when only a small audience remains. I would say that it could be a prohibitive cost. And I would argue that this is a sad truth. That like we mentioned at the start of this video, at the time when most games go offline, They go offline because they don't have enough players to support the cost of those servers that are there. You could argue that at the amount of cost being asked in order to maintain this is, according to their own language, disproportionate to the amount of people that still want to play that game. Don't get me wrong, I am full on for games preservation. I don't want to see these games die, but again, it all comes down to the question of reasonable playable state. If a game like PlanetSide 2 can just be loaded up and you can run around in it, and maybe people can connect to your, to some dedicated server for it or something, sure. Even if you will never relive that perfect experience of what the game is like when you play with so many other people, you can at least play it in some way. But if there aren't enough people to engage in that, then you do have to question, then was it worth the cost if only 10 people want to play this? Because I think that there are some online games that, even if they do allow for offline play, you probably don't have more than 100 people playing those games right now. And depending on the cost of that, prohibitive cost is a correct term to use here. If it costs another $500,000, which is relatively small in the space of making an online game or a massively multiplayer game for sure, if that's the cost of it to keep it online for 100 people after the game's dead, these are questions that shareholders and business owners have to answer. And keep in mind that the games industry is not nearly as financially stable in a lot of cases as it used to be. Bigger companies can absorb this cost a lot better though, so don't get me wrong on that. I think there are some smaller companies though that will see it as, okay, we need to ensure this. This is overhead. We will be required to create this from scratch with people to play it afterwards. And there's a lot of games that succeed in this, right? Games that are not very competitive. But if you plan to make a competitive game for a smaller studio, that competitiveness does increase cost because of the increased necessity of security, of moderation, things of that nature, which people, technology, time, it's all money. Negative impact on investment in games, jobs, growth, and consumer choice. Ensuring an online game can work without official server support requires a significant investment of engineering resources, making it a very costly exercise for video game companies. It's dependent on what game we're talking about. If it's like Project Zomboid, this is not a competitive game. But if it's a game like Apex, yes. And there is a large amount of money that's going to be required to keep that game in a running state, to manage the security of the servers. I don't know how many servers they use for a proper game, but you might have a game, like EVE Online, that's multi-server shards, and in order to run EVE the way it's intended to be played, you would have to host those, and that's a prohibitive cost according to their wording. Many of the costs that games companies would incur in implementing an end-of-life plan would have to be incurred towards the end of the commercial life of the game, when it is no longer commercially viable to continue support. I mean, not really. If you know that these laws exist, you will have to incur those costs. But they will happen at the start of development, right? Because here's the first thing that you do when you make an online game. You hire a server engineer. You hire people to manage the architecture of the server, because the performance of that, the stability of that, the security of that is all crucial to the player experience of playing that multiplayer game. No matter how good that game is, if you have crashes and exploits and issues and performance problems in your multiplayer online game, nobody's going to play it. It doesn't matter how good the game is. So those are the first people that you hire. And if you know that you need to plan for this end-of-life support, you will do that day one. So I don't agree that it's incurred at the end of the commercial life, but it all does flow into budget. Requirements to implement such plans could lead to less risk-taking. True. Fewer investment projects in developing new games. Also true, and potentially fewer jobs. I mean, I agree with the first two bits, right? Because you are making a more risky product because it costs more money, and more money, more budget is more risk. And therefore, the higher the risk is, the fewer investment there will be. That's just, basic business stuff. Potentially fewer jobs. It's hard to judge. It's hard to judge because it's not like people will be playing fewer games. If anything, there will just be fewer online games being made, and there will be more like single player games being made. I don't know. I can't really judge that. I don't think it's right, but I don't think it's wrong. It's just, it's putting, you're looking 10,000 steps ahead, and you can't possibly predict that. Ultimately, it could lead to an increased cost for consumers and less choice. Yes. If a game costs more money to make, there are only two ways that you get a return on investment. You increase the cost of the game, or the ways that you monetize in the game, or you increase your audience size. And in some cases, both are done. Good example is Dragon Age Veilguard. I know this is not an online game, but it's a game that tried to widen its audience so much to account for the increased cost of the budget that they made a game that was like for nobody. So increased cost of game does have to be incurred, and not just incurred. If a game costs $100 million to make, it's going to have to make $300 million to appease the shareholders. Otherwise, they're not going to keep investing. Reputational harm. Allowing players to run private servers with online interaction possibilities could result in players using those games in ways that don't align with the game's company's brand values, leading to a negative association with the brand, thereby harming its reputation. Yes. But I don't think that the EU Commission would remove the rights of publishers to shut down private servers. However, I agree with players that I agree with both sides. Number one, you own the IP. You get to say what you want done with it. It's not a free license to do whatever you want with somebody else's creations and work and even monetize it, right? However, the purpose of the initiative is to keep playing the game and do what I want with it, which goes against IP and copyright laws that currently these rights holders have. I don't know how you solve that. Speaking of, impact on intellectual property rights. Erosion of intellectual property rights. Mandating games companies to keep their online games operable post-official support would undermine their rights and autonomy in deciding how their intellectual property is utilized. There is a vital interest in maintaining effective copyright protection, including protection against circumvention of technologies that control access to copyrighted video game software, where such circumvention is undertaken in circumstances that will lead to the unauthorized public exploitation of games. This is true. And again, as I just said, I don't know any way around this. If Stop Killing Games is to see the proper legislation done that they want. And I think that there will have to be a compromise here that ultimately will be, if intellectual property being resolved is the fence here, it's going to be on the side of the fence that is closer to what we currently have, closer to the status quo. I doubt that the European Commission is going to try and change IP and copyright laws in order to satisfy Stop Killing Games' demands. And if they do, just note, it could take over 10 years for the European Commission to resolve everything legislatively. Insert the word here to mean what I mean. Competition from community-supported versions. Such a requirement could lead to community-supported versions of games competing with official versions. Yeah, that is true. But this only really... Hold on, let me finish it first. Potentially jeopardizing the financial investments of the video game companies. This will lead to confusion between trademarks, and the original trademark holder may be held responsible for actions undertaken by a community-supported version. Yes. Yes, this is true. As somebody who owns a trademark and is applying for a second one, I obviously had to do a lot of research to see whether or not the name of my company conflicts with another game company that existed in time. But I did my due diligence to request access to the rights of this. They did not seek a trademark for their game. Their company is no longer around. And they ultimately didn't really respond in time and didn't challenge my trademark in court. So I am the rights holder of my company's name. However, there are cases, like let's say that there's World of Warcraft and then there's World of Warcraft 2. And they close down World of Warcraft, or even like The Crew is maybe a good example here, where they shut down The Crew 1 to have The Crew 2. Technically speaking, people running private servers would be in violation of the trademarks holders' rights, especially if there are any if people are playing the private version over the new version. That competition could come at a confusion of the player base. So when you're thinking of, like, let's give a good example. My company is called Microraptor Games. Or let's just say it's called Microraptor Games, and there's another company called Microraptor, right? But they make spark plugs for cars, okay? They can't really sue for confusion because there isn't market overlap here, right? Microraptor Games is not siphoning people from buying spark plugs. But if our if our classification of the trademark, so mine is class 9, I think, right? Like downloadable video games. If our classifications are the same or too similar, then there could be potential legal issues where people looking up Microraptor, looking up Microraptor on Google get shown my games or my plugs for, I don't know, a drain pipe or something, like Microraptor plugs, and this is causing confusion with Microraptor spark plugs. The same thing could happen here. Again, this is where I see that the EU Commission is going to side with existing precedents with protecting IP and copyright over enacting consumer rights laws. This is just a suspicion, because like I said, there's already legal precedents. There's already strong protection for legal rights for IP holders, trademark holders, copyright holders, and in order to amend that, from what I've seen and from what I've read, it would be required for each individual country that's part of the EU to amend their own laws regarding this. And as I said, that could happen, but it would also, drastically increase the time and the complexity that it would take to do so, and also decrease the chances for Stop Killing Games to see its full initiative desires through to the end. I hope that made sense. I know this is really complex, and I don't want to be an expert on this. I'm just, let's play it safe and try to figure out how this might fail, why this might fail, and if we can find ways to amend our request to the EU Commission that would, find a compromise between the rights of the companies and the IP holders and the rights of the consumers. Because I think ultimately that's going to be what is going to have to happen. Forfeiture of licensing and reproduction rights. Allowing consumers to create or run modified copies of online games would necessitate games companies to either license additional rights or refrain from enforcing them, effectively leading to a forfeiture of control over these rights. This is kind of already true. Like we mentioned with mods or private servers, it's a gray area. And two cases. Blizzard with WoW has shut down private World of Warcraft servers. Guild Wars, from what I know, has provided a very strict license to the community to run private servers. Now, I think this is the right move to go, is the Guild Wars way, where you allow players to run these private servers, but you write very strict licenses that allow them to shut this down if there's any violation of their rights, if there's any monetization being done, or maybe they allow monetization, but with very certain restrictions. This to me would be a very, very good starting point for compromise, and I think from what I know about Guild Wars, that is the golden holy grail of MMOs that has, I think, done it pretty right. So I don't agree with this number 8, although it isn't inaccurate, but bringing legislation into the mix will require that it is addressed legislatively, and right now it is not. Constraints from third-party IP. Games companies often utilize third-party software and services, which may have licensing terms restricting their use to the commercial life of the game or prohibiting sub-licensing to players. thereby hindering the modification or patching of games for private servers. In particular, this could jeopardize and infringe the copyright of the musical works and lead to legal action from these rights holders on the basis of unauthorized exploitation of their works. So this is very true. We even see games getting shut down now because the licenses for their music has, run up. I think Mafia 1 had that problem, and I think there are a few other examples of that, but I can't name them off the top of my head. Music is one thing. I think that there were also cases of games licensing products. Kojima does this a lot in his games, so I know that Metal Gear Solid and Death Stranding have both had licenses for like sunglasses and whatnot. And when they sign these licenses with these third parties, there are stipulations for this, and that's one of those stipulations may be the inability to sub-license that. I think they even use that term here, but to sub-license that to other players. And in cases like music, that's pretty easy, right? You just remove those songs from the game. But there are other cases where maybe like a car manufacturer or a train manufacturer or a soda like company like Coca-Cola or those sunglasses companies may not allow for that sub-licensing. And again, you could argue that, okay, in that case, just don't sign those licenses. But again, that is when you sign that like agreement, that advertisement, that sponsorship. Sorry, that's the word I was looking for. That comes with money, right? So that is helping to reduce the budget or the cost of the game that you would have to incur as a company, because you can just say, hey, we'll insert Coca-Cola into our game and we get $5 million for it. So, kind of easy choice, right? This isn't wrong, by the way, and this can extend even beyond that to code libraries, right? You might license a third-party piece of software, or a good example was a game that I worked on, Darkest Dungeon, used, oh god, what was it called? It used a sprite program that cost money, and also Fmod to create its sound banks, and this, again, these are restrictions that are placed upon players to modify the game or to do things in the game that the developers paid for themselves. You might also use something like different like server code, or open source server code, or not open source, but licensed server code or server stuff from even other employees or contractors that come with those license restrictions. And there are a lot of loopholes with this, by the way, that companies could take advantage of. They could license code from one of their coders with a inability to redistribute that, and they could argue that they don't have the legal rights to to put out their server binaries. I know you should say that I shouldn't give these people ideas, but I promise you, I am all the way on the other end of the spectrum with regards to ethics and morals and game development. Whatever I think of that they could find loopholes with, I'm sure that there are plenty more that I haven't thought of. So this is a very serious concern that would have to be addressed, that would again start to push into the rights holders' rights at the moment, and that could make this a lot more complex. Constraints from third-party services. I guess this was just kind of what I just talked about. Games depend on third-party services such as platforms on which the game is offered to the consumer. Releasing the code for those services, which would be necessary should a legal requirement allow player communities to run a game, may not be possible, as this would potentially be an IP infringement, correct? Furthermore, game company servers are increasingly run on the cloud. If cloud servers are discontinued, which sometimes happens, this necessitates either shutting down older titles or creating costly workarounds. The latter may not always be possible. Yes, this is to some extent true. A relatively decent example would be GameSpy. And when GameSpy shut down, I don't think I'm mistaken on this, but somebody correct me if I'm wrong. A lot of games were rendered unplayable, including what I remember the original Borderlands, and Gearbox had to go in it and create a patch that removed GameSpy. Now, you could argue, as I would, that sort of DRM is really fucking stupid, and I don't want to see it in my game. But this is a true reality that sometimes those third-party services shut down, and if, for instance, Gearbox was out of, went out of out of business, that game could be rendered inoperable, even though at the time when they released those binaries, if they used those services, that game would be rendered inoperable. So, the game would eventually die and nobody could do anything about it. This is hypothetical in some cases, but the underlying complaint from the Video Games Europe is not entirely wrong here. And I understand, again, players don't care, and they just want to see a solution to this. But just know that this does come at a cost, and that cost is almost always passed down to players in some way. I don't want to see $80 games. I don't want to see $100 games. But if games become more expensive to make, they're going to increase in price. All the above would also affect compliance with PEGI ratings. Really? Where a game has a PEGI age rating and offers multiplayer functionality, the game's company is contractually bound by the PEGI Code of Conduct to respect various obligations related to online safety and privacy. The inability to do so would expose the game's company to legal uncertainty with respect to its contractual obligations under the PEGI Code of Conduct. I don't know. This is the first that I'm seeing that there might be a case of this. I would have to investigate that more. It is not out of the realm of possibility, though, that if it is regulated to provide end-of-life support, then you could say that the company's legal considerations do extend to that end-of-life support because it's regulated, it's mandated, and therefore the PEGI rating would require that the end-of-life support respect the contractual obligations under the PEGI Code of Conduct. Again, I don't know. I'd have to look into that more. I could see it being a reality, though. The importance of consumer protection laws. It can be a very long video, I apologize, but I want to do it justice. Importance of consumer protection laws. Notwithstanding the applicable licensing structure, all video games offered to players in the EU are subject to European consumer protection laws, which can include robust transparency and fairness obligations on games companies and ensure that games companies act reasonably when terminating online support for a game. European consumer protection laws provide consumers with warranties and redress rights with respect to both the game and the physical medium on which the game is made available, but these laws do not transfer ownership of the game to consumers. Games are licensed with the consumer. But here's the thing, I don't think Stop Killing Games is requesting that. However, I think that legally, they are basically requesting it. Well, like I said, it's a bit of a gray area, and I don't know how to resolve that on a legal basis, but Stop Killing Games, I know Ross specifically and explicitly has stated this is not his intention, but it is possible that this would be the necessary requirement should the obligation, or should the requests be properly followed through. That wasn't worded very well, but I hope it made sense. Games are licensed to the consumer in accordance with their terms of service. These set out the terms upon which consumers may access and play games and the situations in which such license rights may be terminated. Consumers are informed that their access to online games and associated services may terminate and are informed with sufficient notice in cases where that does happen. I don't think there's sufficient enough notice. I can tell you what I would like to see. I would like to see a mandated requirement of that notice, and it is significant, at least 3 months, and anybody who purchases the game within a certain period before that notice is given has a right to request a refund, no questions asked, and anybody who purchases it after that notice also has that right too. Again, though, this is, a requirement of the company to pay back those people, and if you have to assume that, then the end of life that you anticipate is actually much sooner than it would be without that, because you would have to refund people if they requested it. It's a whole mess. It's a whole mess, but that's what I would like to see, because I think that's a relatively fair compromise with regards to terms of service that, in my opinion, are not strict enough, or that aren't regulated enough. Transparency. Players must be given reasonable prior notice before any termination of access to the game. I don't know what this is right now, but I don't think it's enough. Reimbursement. The Digital Content Directive provides consumers with price reduction and reimbursement rights in certain circumstances, but also with repair and replacement rights if a game service fails to achieve conformity with certain required warranties. I'm gonna be honest, I recently had to deal with Sony's reimbursements rights, and they are bad. In fact, they are not obligated to refund a pre-order if you have pre-loaded the game. Even if the game is not out yet, if you have preloaded the game but do not have access to it, they technically do not have to give you a refund. I don't want to get into that, but just know I don't think that this is sufficient enough. By any means. Service duration. EU legislation requires that the service aspects of online video games be provided for a reasonable amount of time, taking into account all relevant factors. Do they? I don't know this. If somebody can tell me how much this time is, it would be great. I don't know if this is true. It would be disproportionate for a specific duration to be imposed. Yeah, but they're not asking for it. SKG is not asking for this, as this would need to be valid of all types of services, not just games. Though this is true, if they did require it, it would extend to everything beyond just games. The Unfair Terms Directive prohibits games companies from imposing terms on consumers that significantly imbalance the parties' rights and obligations to the detriment of consumers. So I will have to look up what this Unfair Terms Directive is and what the duration and reimbursement windows are for this. I could only speak on my ass at the moment, and I don't want to do that, so I'm just going to say I don't think it's enough, but I could be wrong. Maybe they do require what I was just asking about. What I was saying would be a perfect, middle ground. I gotta look into it. Video game companies are committed to the preservation of games and their cultural value. Funny joke. It is important to separate the legal proposals being made by the petitioners for specific end-of-life requirements for commercial video games from the question of the preservation of games as creative and cultural works. I agree with that. We need specifics, and it needs to be defined. I agree with this. Video Games Europe and their member companies are committed to and actively support serious professional efforts to preserve video games and recognize the industry's creative contributions under circumstances that do not jeopardize game companies' rights under copyright law. Now, I do not know what member companies are included in this. Let me see here. Do I think that these companies... I see Nintendo in there. Bro, you can't even say this with a straight fucking face. Video Games Europe and their member companies, yeah, Nintendo, well known for supporting video game preservation and the ability for fans to create fan content, sure. Dumb. For example, members regularly donate game copies and hardware to preservation organizations and support museum expeditions featuring games. That's not the same thing. Shut the fuck up. Other video game companies have undertaken the gigantic task of creating video game libraries to support the preservation of games. Embracer Games Archive. Is this true? Tour the archive. Okay, is this a digital archive or? Okay, but donating a game to a physical library like this is... It's not the same thing, man. It's not like I can go visit this. Nah, man, this is not the same thing at all. Not at all. And that doesn't mean that... No, this is not the same thing at all. I'm sorry. However, the industry's innovation and economic activity depends on strong copyright protection for the software and other creative works that are its lifeblood, and preservation efforts should not be confused with uses that could conflict with the normal exploitation of the work by the right holder or unreasonably prejudice the legitimate interests of the author. That's the end of it. So if you guys have been watching my stream lately, you know that I've been talking about this while trying to avoid the massive drama that's been surrounding it. I don't support anybody attacking anybody on this, okay? And I understand that there's people who might have fired the first shot, okay? And I won't name names, but everybody knows who I'm talking about. We shouldn't misunderstand what the initiative says versus what the initiative aims to do. And we shouldn't misunderstand what the European Commission, what we want them to do versus what they are likely to do. And if you've been on my stream, you know that I've said, I want this. I've always been supportive from day one of this initiative. However, I don't see it as being feasible because it would have to be, you would have to go up against IP and copyright laws. And I don't see the European Commission doing this. Which is why at the start of this video, I mentioned that I think that this is an army, a massive one, and a well-intentioned one that is attacking from the wrong angle. But I don't see any other way of doing it. Because how do you get gamers together to come up and fight copyright laws? How do you even attempt this? I don't think you can. So it'll be very interesting to see what the statement is from the European Commission, and from what I understand, we will likely see a response from them before the end of the year. So the signing ends this month, and it'll be about 1 to 3 months before the European Commission provides a response. Now, keep in mind that since the creation of this commission, I think there will only have been about a dozen initiatives that have received 1 million votes. And of those, only 2 of them have received actual legislation made surrounding them, and the others have received either minimal, sort of words ranging from just, hey, we recommend not doing this XYZ, or we're going to do a study about XYZ to see if it's impactful upon people, and maybe follow up later down the line. This is not going to be something where the signatures come in, legislation is made, and we all get to rejoice and play our games forever afterwards. This is likely going to be, if I were a betting man, we receive information that at best they're going to take a look at it and try to find a compromise. At worst, they're going to say that this would inevitably violate the IP and rights of the IP holders. And therefore, they understand that this is something that people are concerned about, and they will provide some guidelines, right, of, hey, this is how we recommend that you release games. Which, of course, these amazingly moral and ethical companies are going to abide by, right? I think that there are a lot of loopholes that could be exploited in this legislation if it's not worded very, very, very correctly. And if those loopholes exist, it could add additional costs to development, or ultimately, at the end of the day, the same result, which is that because these loopholes exist, they will find reasons not to support their games at end of life, but now they require more money to make or more money to develop in this way, or they will have to be more aggressive with monetization, either with microtransactions, ads, DLCs, whatever, in order to make up for the additional costs. So there's just a lot of risks involved with this, and I would like to see it be, done with the due justice that I hope that Stop Killing Games, the initiative and the proposals can achieve. Though I do think there is a matter of this may not have the result that people want, and I don't want that to be a discouragement, because ultimately, when 1.5 million gamers, let's just assume that that's going to be the rough number when this initiative finalizes its votes, even after counting some fraud, say it's over 1 million, because that would be the necessity. This is not a small number, and I think that ultimately people need to vote with their wallets here. If they don't want to see exploitative live service games or companies exploiting consumers' rights or desired rights, don't buy those games. Pirate them. I don't care. It's not my blood on the line here, and ultimately, if you don't support what a company is doing, I just recommend not playing the game. Simple as that. And not paying for it. So that was the Stop Killing Games statement from the Video Games Europe. I apologize that that was a lot longer than I intended, but I hope that this has given some additional insight, some nuance, some thought about the matter. Again, if you want to see me talking with Ross, this was about a year ago. It is on our YouTube. Look for the Stop Killing Games interview with Ross. It was very wonderful. He was a very nice guy, and I hope that he's doing well. I know he's been very busy and a bit stressed. Ross, please stay sane for all of us, and I hope that after the signatures come in, you can do a little bit of resting, because it's kind of out of your hands at that point. But you've done a great job, and ultimately, I really hope that something positive comes of this. So, guys, thank you so much for watching that, and if you want, you can catch us up on our streams or look at our YouTube videos, and see you sometime in the future. Take care, have a nice rest of your weekend, and I hope that we can have some wonderful discussions in the comments below this. Peace, cheers, see you guys.